You won't believe what happened when a decorated general met his match in the most unexpected way possible. Everything seemed like just another day at the military base, until a simple confrontation revealed a truth that would change everything forever. He thought he was just dealing with another worthless recruit, but what he discovered would shake him to his very core. Picture this: a military compound where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and absolute obedience. Where one man's word can make or break a career, and where pride runs deeper than family bonds. But sometimes life has a way of teaching us the most painful lessons when we least expect them. What you're about to hear is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about judgment, family, and the price we pay for our prejudices. Stay with me, because the ending will leave you speechless. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Harrison's training grounds, where the sound of marching boots echoed against the concrete walls like a military drumbeat. General Marcus Stone stood on the elevated platform overlooking the parade ground, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, steel-gray eyes scanning the rows of soldiers with the precision of a hawk hunting prey. At 58, Stone was a legend in the military community, a man who had climbed from the trenches to the stars on his shoulders through sheer determination and an iron will that never bent, never broke. His uniform was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every medal polished to mirror brightness. The general's reputation preceded him wherever he went, fair but merciless, brilliant but unforgiving, a man who demanded perfection because he had achieved it himself. Under his command, Fort Harrison had become one of the most disciplined and efficient military installations in the country. Soldiers spoke his name with a mixture of reverence and fear, knowing that earning his respect was nearly impossible, but losing it was devastatingly easy. But there was one soldier who seemed to test every ounce of the general's legendary patience. Private Daniel Matthews, 23 years old, blonde hair that never quite lay flat despite regulation cuts, and green eyes that held a determination that irritated Stone more than he cared to admit. Matthews had arrived at Fort Harrison 6 months ago, and from day one he had been nothing but trouble in the general's eyes. It wasn't that Matthews was lazy or incompetent, quite the opposite actually. The young man trained harder than most, studied military protocol with obsessive dedication, and never missed an opportunity to volunteer for extra duties. But there was something about him that rubbed General Stone the wrong way, something that triggered a deep-seated irritation that the general couldn't quite explain, even to himself. Maybe it was the way Matthews carried himself with quiet confidence, despite being constantly criticized. Maybe it was how he never seemed to break under pressure, no matter how much Stone pushed him. Or maybe it was something deeper, something that the general refused to acknowledge even in his darkest moments of self-reflection. This particular morning started like any other, with the general conducting his routine inspection of the troops. The soldiers stood at perfect attention, their uniforms pristine, their faces masks of disciplined composure. Stone moved through the ranks with practiced efficiency, his sharp gaze catching every minor infraction, every slight deviation from perfection. When he reached Matthews, he stopped. The general always stopped at Matthews. "Private Matthews!" Stone's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, causing nearby soldiers to tense involuntarily. "Your boots." Matthews looked down at his perfectly polished boots, confusion flickering across his features. "Sir? Are you questioning me, Private?" The general's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more threat than a shout. "No, sir. I was simply what? Simply thinking you know better than a superior officer?" Stone stepped closer, close enough that Matthews could smell the general's aftershave, could see the network of fine lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of command and conflict. "Your boots are a disgrace to this uniform, to this base, and to every soldier who has ever worn the colors of our great nation." The other soldiers remained statue still, but Matthews could feel their eyes on him, could sense their mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the target of the general's wrath. He looked down at his boots again. They were spotless, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the morning sun. Every soldier on the line knew it. The general knew it too. "Sir, with respect, I polished these boots for over an hour last night. They meet all regulation standards and— Did I ask for your opinion, Private?" Stone's voice rose now, carrying across the parade ground and drawing the attention of soldiers from other units. "Did I ask you to defend your pitiful excuse for military bearing?" Matthews felt his jaw clench, but his voice remained steady. "No, sir. That's right. Because your opinion means nothing here. You are nothing here. You think because you volunteer for extra duty and stay up all night studying that you're something special? You think you have what it takes to be more than the pathetic excuse for a soldier standing in front of me?" The words hit like physical blows, but Matthews stood his ground. This wasn't the first time General Stone had singled him out, and it wouldn't be the last. Over the past 6 months, these confrontations had become almost routine, each one more intense than the last. Each one leaving Matthews questioning why he had ever thought he could make it in the military. "You will report to the motor pool after evening chow," Stone continued, his voice now carrying across the entire parade ground. "You will spend the night cleaning every vehicle until they shine brighter than your pathetic excuse for boots. And if I find so much as a speck of dust on any of them, you'll do it again tomorrow night, and the night after that, until you learn what it means to meet the standards of this man's army. Sir, I have guard duty scheduled for tonight. Sergeant Williams assigned me to— Are you telling me that you can't handle your assigned duties, Private?" The general's eyes narrowed to slits. "Are you admitting that you're too weak, too incompetent to serve your country properly?" Matthews felt the familiar burn of injustice in his chest, the same feeling that had plagued him since childhood, the sense that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, it would never be good enough for the people who were supposed to matter most. But he had learned long ago to swallow that feeling, to bury it deep where it couldn't hurt him. "No, sir. I'll handle both assignments." General Stone stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Something flickered in his eyes. Was it disappointment, frustration, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "See that you do." And Matthews, "Yes, sir? The next time you even think about questioning my judgment, you'll find yourself on the first transport out of here with a discharge so dishonorable it'll follow you for the rest of your miserable life. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." Stone turned on his heel and continued down the line, leaving Matthews standing at attention, his face burning with embarrassment and suppressed anger. The other soldiers remained motionless, but he could feel their sympathy and their relief that they weren't in his position. As the general moved away, Matthews caught fragments of whispered conversations from the soldiers around him. They had all witnessed these confrontations before, had all seen how Stone seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating the young private. Some felt sorry for Matthews, others thought he brought it on himself by refusing to keep his head down and blend into the background. But none of them understood the real reason behind the general's behavior. None of them could see the internal war raging in Stone's mind every time he looked at Private Matthews, the way something deep in his chest twisted with emotions he refused to name or acknowledge. After the inspection, Matthews found himself assigned to kitchen duty, scrubbing pots and cleaning floors, while his fellow soldiers enjoyed their free time. It was another punishment disguised as routine duty, another way for General Stone to remind him of his place in the military hierarchy. As he worked, his mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with his mother just 2 weeks ago. She had called to check on him, as she did every month, her voice filled with the same mixture of hope and worry that had colored their relationship since he was a child. "Are you happy, Daniel?" she had asked. "Are you finding what you're looking for?" He had wanted to tell her about General Stone, about the constant humiliation and the way his superior seemed determined to break him. But how could he explain something he didn't understand himself? How could he tell her that sometimes, when the general looked at him with those cold grey eyes, Matthews felt like he was staring into the face of a stranger who should have meant more to him than any other person in the world? Instead, he had given her the same answer he always did. "I'm fine, Mom. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. Nothing had been fine for a very long time, and Matthews was beginning to wonder if it ever would be. The kitchen duty lasted until well past sunset, leaving Matthews barely enough time to grab a quick dinner before reporting to the motor pool for his punishment detail. As he made his way across the base, he passed groups of soldiers enjoying their evening off, playing cards, writing letters home, sharing stories and laughter that reminded him of everything he was missing. The motor pool was a vast concrete structure filled with military vehicles of every description. Trucks, jeeps, armored personnel carriers, and maintenance equipment that kept the base operational. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, every surface seemed to gleam with an unforgiving brightness that would reveal the slightest imperfection. Matthews had barely begun cleaning the first truck when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see General Stone approaching, his uniform still immaculate despite the late hour, his expression as stern as ever. "Working hard, Private," the general's voice echoed in the empty motor pool. "Yes, sir." Matthews continued scrubbing, not trusting himself to say more. "Good. Because this is where you belong, Matthews. This is the ceiling of your potential. Cleaning vehicles and following orders without question or complaint. Some men are born to lead, others to follow, and a rare few are destined for greatness. But you're destined for this." Stone gestured at the motor pool, at the endless rows of vehicles that needed maintenance and care. "This is your legacy, Private. This is all you'll ever be." Matthews stopped scrubbing and straightened up, his jaw tight with controlled emotion. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the space between them, and something passed between them. A moment of recognition, of challenge, of unspoken truths that neither was ready to acknowledge. "With respect, sir," Matthews said quietly, "I believe a man's legacy is determined by his actions, not by what others think of his potential." General Stone's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, or might have been something else entirely. "Is that what you believe, Private?" "Yes, sir, it is." "Then you're even more naive than I thought." Stone turned to leave, then paused. "You have until dawn to finish every vehicle in this pool. If even one fails inspection, you'll spend tomorrow night doing it again. And Matthews—" "Yes, sir." "A smart soldier would learn to keep his philosophies to himself." "Damn!" As the general's footsteps faded into the distance, Matthews returned to his work, scrubbing and polishing with mechanical precision, while his mind raced with questions that had no answers. Why did General Stone seem to take such personal satisfaction in humiliating him? Why did every interaction feel like a test he was destined to fail? And why, despite everything, did he still feel compelled to prove himself to a man who seemed determined never to be impressed? The night stretched on, long and lonely, filled with the sound of scrubbing brushes and the hum of fluorescent lights. As Matthews worked, he thought about his childhood, about growing up without a father, about the questions his mother had never been able to answer, and the empty space in his life that had driven him to seek purpose in military service. He had joined the army, hoping to find structure, discipline, and perhaps the kind of father figure he had never known. Instead, he had found General Stone, a man who seemed to embody everything Matthews had hoped for and everything he feared about masculinity and authority. By the time dawn broke over Fort Harrison, Matthews had cleaned every vehicle in the motor pool to pristine condition. His hands were raw, his back ached, and his eyes burned from exhaustion, but every surface gleamed with mirror brightness. He had met the general's impossible standard, just as he always did, knowing that it would never be enough to earn the recognition he craved. As the base came to life around him, Matthews prepared for another day of routine humiliation and unspoken challenges. He had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would change everything, that the truth he had been searching for his entire life was closer than he could possibly imagine. The morning inspection would come and go, followed by training exercises and duty assignments that would push both men toward a confrontation that had been building for months. And somewhere in the space between command and obedience, between expectation and reality, a truth would emerge that would shatter everything both men thought they knew about family, legacy, and the bonds that define us. But for now, in the grey light of dawn, Private Daniel Matthews stood alone in the motor pool, surrounded by gleaming vehicles that reflected his tired face like mirrors, still believing that he was nothing more than a soldier trying to prove himself to a superior who would never be satisfied. He had no idea that the man he was trying so desperately to impress was struggling with demons of his own, fighting a battle between duty and recognition that would soon force him to confront the most important truth of his life. The story was just beginning, and neither man was prepared for where it would lead them. You see, sometimes the universe has a way of pushing people toward truths they're not ready to face, and what happened next would test everything both the general and the private thought they knew about strength, family, and the price of pride. Stay with me, because what unfolds in this story will challenge everything you think you know about judgment and family bonds. The revelation that's coming will leave you speechless, and trust me, you need to hear how this incredible story ends. 3 weeks had passed since that night in the motor pool, and the tension between General Stone and Private Matthews had reached a breaking point that everyone on the base could feel. It was like watching a storm build on the horizon. You knew it was coming. You could sense the electricity in the air, but no one could predict exactly when or how it would strike. The other soldiers had begun to take notice of the escalating conflict. During mess hall conversations and late-night discussions in the barracks, Matthews had become a topic of both sympathy and speculation. Some of the more experienced soldiers recognized the pattern. They had seen officers who seemed to single out particular subordinates for reasons that went beyond normal military discipline. Sergeant Williams, a 20-year veteran with 3 tours of combat under his belt, had tried to counsel Matthews during one of their training sessions. "Listen, son," he had said, his voice low enough that only Matthews could hear. "I've seen this before. Sometimes an officer gets it in his head that a particular soldier needs extra attention. The smart play is to keep your head down, do your job, and wait for reassignment." But Matthews couldn't do that. Something deep inside him refused to back down, refused to accept that he was destined to be nothing more than General Stone's personal target for frustration and disappointment. Every humiliation only strengthened his resolve to prove himself, even though he couldn't articulate exactly what he was trying to prove or to whom. The breaking point came during a routine training exercise that should have been straightforward. The unit was conducting urban warfare drills in the mock city that had been constructed on the eastern edge of the base, a collection of buildings and obstacles designed to simulate combat conditions in civilian environments. General Stone was observing from the command post, surrounded by junior officers who hung on his every word and gesture. The exercise was designed to test the soldiers' ability to work as a team, to communicate under pressure, and to adapt to changing tactical situations. Matthews was leading a squad of 5 soldiers through a particularly challenging scenario. They were tasked with securing a building while avoiding civilian casualties and neutralizing enemy combatants. It was the kind of exercise that required split-second decision-making and absolute trust in your fellow soldiers. Everything was going according to plan until the scenario changed. The training supervisors introduced an unexpected element, a simulated hostage situation that required the squad to adapt their tactics on the fly. Matthews made the call to alter their approach, directing his team to circle around the building and enter from an unexpected angle. It was a brilliant tactical decision that caught the opposing force completely off guard. Matthews's squad successfully secured the building, neutralized the enemy combatants, and rescued the hostages without a single casualty. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking and leadership under pressure that the exercise was designed to evaluate. The other soldiers cheered as Matthews emerged from the building, his face flushed with exertion and satisfaction. For a moment, it looked like he had finally achieved something that would earn him the recognition he had been seeking. The junior officers were nodding approvingly, making notes about his performance that would go into his permanent record. But General Stone saw something different. As he watched Matthews accept congratulations from his fellow soldiers, something dark twisted in his chest. Instead of pride or satisfaction, he felt a familiar irritation that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. "Gather the squad!" Stone's voice cut across the celebration like a blade. The soldiers immediately fell silent and formed up in a straight line, their earlier enthusiasm evaporating under the general's withering gaze. Stone approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. When he reached Matthews, who stood at the center of the line, he stopped and stared at the young private for what felt like an eternity. "Private Matthews," Stone said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "Explain your decision to deviate from the established tactical protocol." Matthews straightened his shoulders, his voice steady and confident. "Sir, the scenario changed unexpectedly. I assessed the new conditions and determined that our original approach would result in civilian casualties. The flanking maneuver allowed us to achieve our objectives while minimizing risk to innocent lives." "I see." Stone continued staring at him, his gray eyes reflecting nothing. "And who gave you permission to make that assessment?" "Sir, the exercise parameters included adapting to changing conditions. I used my training and judgment to—" "Your judgment." Stone's voice dropped to that dangerous whisper that every soldier on the base had learned to fear. "Private Matthews believes his judgment is superior to established military doctrine. Private Matthews thinks he knows better than the officers who designed this exercise, better than the strategists who developed these protocols, better than the generals who have been fighting wars since before he was born." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Matthews felt his face flush, not with pride this time, but with the familiar burn of injustice that had become his constant companion. "Sir, I was following the spirit of the exercise. The objective was to follow orders, Private. The objective was to demonstrate that you understand your place in the chain of command. But instead, you chose to show off, to demonstrate your supposed superiority over your fellow soldiers and your superiors." Stone began to pace in front of the assembled squad, his voice growing louder with each step. "This is exactly the kind of arrogance that gets soldiers killed in real combat. This is the kind of reckless individualism that breaks down unit cohesion and puts lives at risk. Private Matthews thinks he's smarter than the system, thinks he can improvise his way to glory without regard for the consequences." Matthews felt his control slipping. 6 months of constant criticism, of being singled out for punishment regardless of his performance, of watching his achievements be twisted into failures. It was all building to this moment. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "With respect, sir," Matthews said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "my decision saved lives. In a real combat situation, the flexibility to adapt tactics based on changing conditions is exactly what separates successful missions from disasters." The silence that followed was deafening. Every soldier on the training ground seemed to hold their breath, waiting for General Stone's response. The junior officers exchanged worried glances, recognizing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal military discipline. Stone stopped pacing and turned to face Matthews directly. When he spoke, His voice was quiet, but filled with a cold fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than professional disappointment. "You think you're special, don't you, Private? You think you have what it takes to be a leader, to make the hard decisions, to earn the respect of your fellow soldiers?" Stone stepped closer, close enough that Matthews could see the network of scars on his hands, the result of decades of military service. "But I see what you really are. I see through the facade, through the extra effort and the volunteering and the desperate need to prove yourself." Stone's voice grew louder now, carrying across the training ground and drawing the attention of soldiers from other units. "You're weak, Matthews. You're soft and undisciplined and completely unsuited for military service. You think you can earn respect through individual achievement, but respect is given to those who understand their place, who follow orders without question, who put the needs of the unit above their own ego." Each word hit like a physical blow. But Matthews stood his ground. His fellow squad members watched in uncomfortable silence, knowing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal military correction. "You want to know what I think of your tactical brilliance, Private?" Stone gestured toward the mock building where the exercise had taken place. "I think it was a fluke. I think you got lucky, and now you're trying to pretend it was skill. But I know better. I know exactly what you are and what you're not." Stone paused, studying Matthew's face with those cold grey eyes. "You're not officer material. You're not leadership material. You're barely soldier material. And if you think one successful exercise is going to change my assessment of your capabilities, you're even more deluded than I thought." Matthews felt something break inside him, some last restraint that had been holding back months of accumulated frustration and hurt. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but filled with a conviction that surprised even him. "You're wrong about me, sir." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Stone's eyes narrowed, his body tensing as if preparing for physical combat. "What did you say, Private?" "I said you're wrong about me." Matthew's voice grew stronger, more confident. "You've been wrong about me since the day I arrived at this base. You've judged me based on something I don't understand, criticized me for failures that exist only in your mind, and punished me for successes that you refuse to acknowledge." The junior officers were making frantic gestures, trying to signal Matthews to stop, to back down, before he crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Matthews was beyond caring about consequences now. 6 months of swallowed pride and suppressed anger had finally found their voice. "I don't know what I did to earn your contempt, sir, but I know it has nothing to do with my performance as a soldier. I've met every standard, exceeded every expectation, and volunteered for every assignment. But no matter what I do, it's never enough for you. Nothing I achieve will ever be good enough because you've decided I'm a failure before I even try." Stone's face had gone white with fury, but Matthews wasn't finished. "You want to know what I think, General? I think you see something in me that threatens you. I think my success reminds you of something you'd rather forget. And rather than deal with whatever that is, you've decided to tear me down instead of building me up." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Stone stared at Matthews with an expression that mixed rage, shock, and something else, something that looked almost like pain. When Stone finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. "Report to my office immediately following evening formation, Private Matthews, and pray that I don't decide your military career ends today." Stone turned and walked away, leaving Matthews standing at attention with his squad, his heart pounding and his mind reeling from what had just happened. The other soldiers remained frozen for several moments before slowly beginning to disperse, shooting worried glances at Matthews as they went. As the training ground emptied, Matthews found himself alone with the weight of what he had done. He had crossed a line that every military manual warned against crossing. He had challenged a superior officer publicly, questioned his judgment, and accused him of personal bias. Any one of those offenses could result in court-martial and dishonorable discharge. But for the first time in 6 months, Matthews didn't regret his actions. He had finally said what needed to be said, had finally stood up for himself against the constant barrage of criticism and contempt. Whatever consequences followed, at least he had maintained his dignity and his sense of self-worth. What Matthews didn't know was that General Stone was walking back to his office with his own mind in turmoil. The private's words had hit closer to home than Stone cared to admit. There was something about Matthews that did remind him of things he'd rather forget. Memories of choices made and paths not taken, of responsibilities abandoned and promises broken. As Stone sat behind his desk that afternoon, staring at Matthews' personnel file, he found himself studying the young man's face in his official photograph. There was something familiar about those green eyes, something that stirred memories he had spent years trying to suppress. The file contained all the basic information: birth date, place of birth, next of kin, education history, military aptitude scores. Matthews had been born in Cedar Falls, Iowa, 23 years ago. His mother was listed as Sarah Matthews, occupation teacher, father unknown. Stone stared at that line for a long time. Father unknown. Something about it nagged at him, triggered a memory that he couldn't quite grasp. He pulled out a calculator and began working backward from Matthew's birth date, counting months and years, trying to remember where he had been 24 years ago. 24 years ago, Stone had been a young lieutenant stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. He was married then, to a woman named Lisa, who had grown tired of military life and the constant relocations that came with it. Their marriage had been deteriorating for months when he had been sent on a training assignment to a civilian contractor facility in Iowa. The assignment had lasted 6 weeks. Stone remembered it clearly because it had been one of the few times in his military career when he had been away from base life, living in a hotel, eating in restaurants, interacting with civilians on a daily basis. It had felt like a vacation from the rigid structure of military life, and there had been a woman, a teacher at the local school who had caught his eye, who had made him forget about his failing marriage and his military obligations for a few precious weeks. Sarah. Her name had been Sarah. Stone felt his hands begin to shake as the memory came flooding back. He had spent 6 weeks with Sarah, telling himself that what happened away from base didn't count, that it was just a temporary escape from the problems waiting for him back home. When the assignment ended, he had returned to Fort Campbell, to Lisa, to his military career. He had never contacted Sarah again, had never tried to find out if their brief relationship had consequences beyond the guilt he carried. Within a year, his marriage to Lisa had ended in divorce, and he had thrown himself into his military career with single-minded devotion, using ambition and achievement to bury the memory of those 6 weeks in Iowa. But now, staring at Matthews's personnel file, Stone felt those memories rushing back with devastating clarity. The timeline matched. The location matched. And those green eyes that had seemed so familiar suddenly made terrible sense. Stone's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a decade. When the voice answered on the 3rd ring, he could barely force the words past the constriction in his throat. "Personnel records. This is Corporal Jenkins. This is General Stone. I need a complete background check on Private Daniel Matthews, service number 247893456. I need everything: birth records, family history, medical records, school transcripts, everything you can find." "Yes, sir. How quickly do you need this?" Stone looked at his watch. Matthews would be reporting to his office in 3 hours for what the private probably expected to be his final confrontation with military authority. "I need it in 2 hours, Corporal. This is priority 1. As Stone hung up the phone, he realized that his entire world was about to change. The young man he had been tormenting for 6 months, the soldier he had convinced himself was weak and unworthy, might be his son. The child he had never known he had, the responsibility he had never acknowledged, had been standing in front of him all this time. and Stone had spent 6 months systematically trying to destroy him. The general sat alone in his office, surrounded by the symbols of his military achievement, commendations, photographs with presidents and foreign dignitaries, awards that represented decades of distinguished service. But all of it felt hollow now, meaningless in the face of what he was beginning to understand. If Matthews was his son, then every cruel word, every humiliation, every attempt to break his spirit had been an assault on his own flesh and blood. The boy he had been trying to tear down was the child he had unknowingly abandoned 23 years ago. Stone thought about Sarah, about the woman he had left behind without a second thought. She would have been pregnant when he returned to base, facing the prospect of raising a child alone while he pursued his military career without ever knowing he was a father. The irony was crushing. Matthews had joined the military seeking structure, discipline, and perhaps a father figure. Instead, he had found his actual father, a man who had been systematically destroying him out of ignorance and unexamined prejudice. 2 hours later, when the personnel records arrived, Stone's worst fears were confirmed. Daniel Robert Matthews, born in Cedar Falls, Iowa, to Sarah Ann Matthews. Father unknown, but hospital records indicated that Sarah had mentioned the father was military personnel stationed temporarily in the area. The pieces fell into place with devastating precision. The timeline matched perfectly with Stone's assignment in Iowa. The location was exact, and when Stone found Sarah's current address and phone number in the file, he knew he had to make the call that would change everything. His hands were shaking as he dialed the number. When a woman's voice answered, he could barely speak. "Sarah, this is Marcus Stone. I don't know if you remember me, but I need to ask you something very important." There was a long pause, then a sharp intake of breath. "Marcus, my God, I never thought I'd hear from you again. Is everything all right?" "Sarah, I need you to tell me the truth about something. Your son, Daniel. Is he my son?" The silence that followed seemed to last forever. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was quiet but filled with 23 years of unanswered questions and unspoken hurt. "Yes, Marcus. Daniel is your son. He's always been your son." Stone felt the world tilt around him. Everything he thought he knew about himself, about Matthews, about the past 6 months, suddenly looked completely different. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you contact me when you found out you were pregnant?" "Because you made it very clear that what we had was temporary. You went back to your wife, to your life, without so much as a goodbye. What was I supposed to do? Track you down and demand that you abandon your family for a child you never wanted?" The accusation hit Stone like a physical blow because it was absolutely true. He had treated Sarah like a temporary diversion, had never considered that she might face consequences from their relationship. "Does he know? Does Daniel know I'm his father?" "No, I never told him your name. I never told him you were military. When he decided to enlist, I thought about warning you, but I didn't even know where you were stationed. I just hoped." "Hoped what?" "I hoped that maybe, somehow, you might recognize something in him. I hoped that if you ever met him, you might see yourself in his eyes and figure out the truth." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I never imagined he would end up under your command. I never imagined you would..." "Would what?" "Marcus, he calls me every few weeks. He never complains, but I can hear it in his voice. Someone at his base is making his life hell. Someone is convinced he'll never amount to anything, no matter how hard he tries. Is that person you?" Stone closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of what he had done crushing down on him. For 6 months, he had been systematically destroying his own son, driven by instincts and emotions he hadn't understood. Matthew's determination, his refusal to back down, his quiet strength in the face of constant criticism, it had all reminded Stone of himself at that age, and he had hated the reminder. "Sarah, I need to see him. I need to talk to him. He's supposed to report to my office in an hour, and I don't know what to say." "Tell him the truth, Marcus. Tell him who you are." Tell him that you're sorry, and tell him that despite everything, his father is finally proud of him." As Stone hung up the phone, he realized that the conversation with Matthews would be the most important of his entire life. Everything that happened next would determine whether he could repair the damage he had done, whether he could build a relationship with the son he had unknowingly tried to destroy. The general, who had never backed down from any challenge, who had faced enemy fire and political battles with equal composure, was terrified of the conversation that lay ahead. Because this time, the stakes weren't just his career or his reputation, they were his family, his legacy, and his chance to finally be the father his son had been searching for all along. The clock on his desk showed 15 minutes until Matthews was scheduled to report. Stone spent those minutes staring at his son's photograph, seeing for the first time the resemblance he had been blind to for 6 months. The determined set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the intelligence in his eyes. It was all there, all the markers of their shared DNA that Stone had been too angry and too proud to recognize. When the knock came at his door, Stone felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment everything changed, the moment when General Marcus Stone would have to face the most important truth of his life. "Enter," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. Private Daniel Matthews stepped through the door and stood at attention, his face set in the mask of military discipline that had become second nature over the past 6 months. But Stone could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed how much this confrontation meant to him. "Private Matthews, reporting as ordered, sir." Stone stared at his son for a long moment, seeing him clearly for the first time. This young man who had been seeking approval and recognition was his own flesh and blood, the child he had abandoned without ever knowing he existed. "At ease, Private," Stone said quietly, his voice lacking its usual edge of authority. Matthews relaxed slightly, but remained standing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the general's head. The standard military position of respectful attention, but Stone could see the wariness in his posture, the expectation of another humiliation. "Do you know why you're here, Matthews?" "Yes, sir, because I spoke out of turn during the training exercise, because I challenged your authority in front of the other soldiers." Stone nodded slowly. "That's part of it, but there's something else we need to discuss, something far more important than military discipline." For the first time, Matthew's eyes flickered down to meet his, confusion replacing the carefully controlled indifference he had learned to wear like armor. "Sir?" Stone stood up and walked around his desk, stopping a few feet away from Matthews. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the familiar curve of the jawline, the way Matthews held his head when he was thinking? The stubborn set of his shoulders that Stone recognized from looking in the mirror every morning. 24 years ago, Stone began, his voice careful and measured. "I was a young lieutenant stationed at Fort Campbell. I was sent on a temporary assignment to Iowa to a facility in Cedar Falls. I was there for 6 weeks. Matthew's face didn't change, but Stone could see something shifting in his eyes, a wariness that went beyond military protocol. "While I was there, I met someone, a teacher at the local school. Her name was Sarah." Stone paused, watching as the color drained from Matthews's face. Sarah Matthews. The silence in the office was deafening. Matthews stood frozen, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with dawning realization and disbelief. That's my mother's name," Matthews whispered. "I know." Stone's voice was gentler than Matthews had ever heard it. "I called her this afternoon. I asked her a question I should have asked 23 years ago." Matthews was shaking now, his military composure cracking as the implications of Stone's words sank in. "What question?" "I asked her if you were my son." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 23 years of separation and misunderstanding. Matthews stared at Stone with an expression of shock, hope, and betrayal, all mixed together. "And what did she tell you?" Matthews' voice was barely audible. She told me the truth I was too self-centered and irresponsible to seek out 23 years ago. Stone took a deep breath. Daniel, you're my son. Matthews staggered backward, as if he'd been physically struck. His carefully maintained military bearing collapsed entirely as he groped for the chair behind him and sank into it, his face pale and his hands trembling. You're my father? The words came out strangled, filled with 23 years of questions and longing. You've been my father this entire time? Yes. Stone's own voice was thick with emotion now, and for 6 months I've been the worst father imaginable. I've humiliated you, criticized you, tried to break your spirit, all because I was too blind and too proud to see what was right in front of me. Matthews looked up at him with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. But why? Why did you hate me so much? What did I do wrong? Nothing. Stone's voice cracked. You did nothing wrong, Daniel. You were perfect. You were everything a father should be proud of, and I was too damaged and too afraid to recognize it. Stone walked back to his desk and picked up Matthew's personnel file, holding it like evidence of his own failure. You came here looking for structure, for discipline, for someone to guide you. You came here looking for a father, and instead you found me. A man so consumed with his own issues that he couldn't see his own son standing in front of him. I don't understand. Matthews wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, no longer caring about military protocol. If you're my father, why did it feel like you hated me from the moment I arrived? Stone sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 58 years. Because you reminded me of myself at your age? Because you have all the qualities I used to have before the military hardened me into someone I barely recognize. Because every time I looked at you, I saw the young man I used to be, full of hope and determination and belief that I could make a difference in the world. He paused, struggling to find words for emotions he had buried for decades. And I hated that reminder. I hated seeing what I used to be because it forced me to confront what I had become. So I tried to break you down, to make you as cynical and hardened as I am, because I couldn't bear to watch you succeed where I had failed to maintain my integrity. Matthews was crying openly now, tears streaming down his face as 23 years of questions finally found their answers. All my life, I wondered what my father was like. I wondered if he was proud of me, if he thought about me, if he would have loved me, if he had known I existed. And I gave you the worst possible answer to all those questions. Stone's own eyes were wet now. I made you think you were worthless, that you would never be good enough, that you were destined for failure. I made you believe that your own father thought you were a disappointment. But you didn't know. Matthews said quietly. You didn't know I was your son. That's no excuse. Stone stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the base where his son had been suffering under his command. A good leader, a good man, doesn't treat any soldier the way I treated you. The fact that you were my son just makes it worse, but it doesn't excuse what I did. Matthews stood up slowly, wiping his face and trying to regain some semblance of composure. What happens now? Do I get transferred? Do we pretend this conversation never happened? Stone turned back to face him, and for the first time in 6 months, Matthews saw something in the general's eyes that looked like warmth. What happens now is that I try to be the father you deserved all along. What happens now is that I spend the rest of my life making up for the damage I've done. But you're still my commanding officer. You're still a general, and I'm still a private. How is this supposed to work? Stone considered this for a moment. It was a legitimate question, with no easy answers. Military regulations were clear about fraternization and conflicts of interest, but they had never contemplated a situation quite like this one. I'll have you transferred to another unit, Stone said finally. Someone else's command, someone who can evaluate your performance without the baggage we've created. But before that happens, there are some things I need to say to you, not as your commanding officer, but as your father. Matthews nodded, his eyes fixed on Stone's face as if trying to memorize every detail. First, I want you to know that your mother is an extraordinary woman. She raised you alone, without any help from me, and she did a remarkable job. The man you've become, your integrity, your determination, your refusal to give up even when facing impossible odds, all of that comes from her." Stone's voice grew stronger, more certain. "Second, I want you to know that from this moment forward, you have a father who is proud of you, not because of what you might accomplish in the future, but because of who you already are. You're brave, you're honorable, you're intelligent, and you're strong enough to stand up to a superior officer when principle demands it." Matthews was crying again, but these were different tears, tears of relief and recognition, and a lifetime of longing finally being fulfilled. "And third," Stone continued, his own voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that I love you. I've loved you from the moment I understood who you were, and I will love you for the rest of my life. I know I have no right to expect you to love me back after what I've put you through, but I hope that someday, when you've had time to process all of this, you might be willing to give me a chance to be your father." Matthews stood up and walked toward Stone, his movements uncertain but determined. When he was close enough, he reached out tentatively, as if asking permission. Stone opened his arms, and for the first time in 23 years, father and son embraced. They held each other tightly, both crying now, both mourning the years they had lost and celebrating the connection they had finally found. It wasn't the reunion either of them had imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs. When they finally separated, both men were struggling to regain their composure. Stone handed Matthews a handkerchief, and they both took a few moments to collect themselves. "What do I call you now?" Matthews asked. "I mean, here on base, you're still General Stone. But what am I supposed to call you when we're alone?" Stone smiled for the first time in months. "What do you want to call me?" Matthews considered this carefully. "I've called you Sir for 6 months, and it never felt right. I've wondered my whole life what I would call my father if I ever met him." He paused, studying Stone's face. "Would it be okay if I called you Dad?" The word hit Stone like a physical force, 23 years of regret and longing compressed into a single syllable. "I would be honored if you called me Dad." "Okay, Dad," Matthews smiled through his tears. "That's going to take some getting used to." "For both of us," Stone agreed. "Daniel, I know we have a lot to work through. 23 years of separation doesn't disappear overnight. There will be questions, difficult conversations, probably some anger once the shock wears off. But I want you to know that I'm committed to this. I'm committed to being your father, to building a relationship with you, to making up for lost time." "I want that too," Matthews said. "I've wanted it my whole life. But you're right, it's going to be complicated. There's a lot of hurt to work through, a lot of questions that need answers." Stone nodded. "We'll take it one day at a time. The first step is getting you transferred to a unit where you can succeed without any interference from me. I want to see you achieve everything you're capable of, and you'll never be able to do that while you're under my command." "What about the other soldiers? What about the confrontation earlier today? There will be questions about why I'm suddenly being transferred." "Let me worry about that," Stone said. "As far as anyone else is concerned, you're being transferred because your skills are needed elsewhere. Your military record will reflect your actual performance, not my personal prejudices." Matthews nodded, then looked uncertain again. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "My mother, do you still have feelings for her? I mean, I know it was 24 years ago, but—" Stone considered the question carefully. "Your mother is a wonderful woman, and what we shared was real and meaningful, but that was a long time ago, and we're both different people now. My focus right now is on building a relationship with you, on being the father you deserve. Whatever happens between your mother and me will depend on a lot of factors that we haven't even begun to explore." "But you'd like to see her again?" "Yes," Stone admitted. "I'd like the chance to apologize to her, to thank her for raising you, and to see if we can build some kind of relationship that works for all of us. But that's going to be complicated too." Matthews smiled slightly. "Everything about this is complicated." That's true, but some things are worth the complication. They talked for another hour, covering practical matters like the transfer process and when Matthews might be able to visit his mother, but also beginning to share stories about their lives, their experiences, their hopes for the future. It was awkward at times, the conversation stumbling over 23 years of separation and 6 months of hostility, but it was also healing. As the evening grew late, Stone realized that he had never felt more hopeful about anything in his entire military career. Finding his son, finally understanding the truth about their relationship, had given him a sense of purpose that went far beyond rank and achievement. "I should let you go," Stone said finally. "You need time to process all of this, and I need to start making arrangements for your transfer." Matthews stood up, then hesitated. "Dad, thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for finally letting me know who I am." "Thank you for forgiving me," Stone replied. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be your father." As Matthews left the office, Stone sat alone with his thoughts, surrounded by the symbols of his military success, but focused entirely on the relationship he was finally going to have with his son. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations with his superiors about the transfer, explanations to other soldiers about Matthews's sudden reassignment. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, General Marcus Stone felt like a father. And for the first time in 6 months, he felt like the kind of man his son could be proud of. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. There would be visits to Iowa, conversations with Sarah, family dinners and holidays, and all the ordinary moments that make up a relationship between father and son. There would also be challenges, moments of doubt, the inevitable friction that comes with building a relationship on the foundation of lost time and misunderstanding. But as Stone sat in his office that night, looking at his son's personnel file and finally seeing it clearly, he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Father and son, united at last by truth and love, and the unbreakable bonds of family. The general who had built his career on strength and authority had finally learned the most important lesson of his life, that real strength comes from admitting your mistakes, and real authority comes from earning the love and respect of those who matter most. And somewhere in the barracks, Private Daniel Matthews was calling his mother to tell her that, after 23 years of questions, he had finally found his father. The conversation would be tearful and joyful and complicated, just like everything else about this extraordinary situation. But for both men, father and son, the most important truth had finally been revealed. They belonged to each other, had always belonged to each other, and nothing, not military protocol, not years of separation, not months of misunderstanding, could change that fundamental reality. The story of General Stone and Private Matthews was really the story of every parent and child who has ever struggled to find each other across the barriers of time, circumstance, and human failure. It was a story about redemption and forgiveness, about the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds, and about the unbreakable bond between a father and son who had finally found their way home to each other. So there you have it, a story that proves blood truly is thicker than water, and that sometimes the very thing we're searching for is right in front of us, hidden behind our own assumptions and prejudices. General Stone spent 6 months trying to break down a soldier he thought was weak and unworthy, only to discover that soldier was his own son. A young man with the same determination and courage that had made Stone himself a successful military leader. What strikes me most about this story is how both men were searching for the same thing without realizing it. Stone was looking for a legacy, for someone to carry on his values and his commitment to service. Matthews was looking for a father figure, for someone to guide and mentor him. They were both getting exactly what they needed, but their own emotions and expectations blinded them to the truth. This story makes me think about all the relationships in our own lives where we might be making assumptions, where we might be judging people based on incomplete information or our own unresolved issues. How many opportunities for connection do we miss because we're too proud or too afraid to see what's really in front of us? I'd love to hear what you think about this incredible story. Did you see the connection between the general and the private before the big revelation? What would you have done if you were in Matthew's position, facing constant criticism from a superior who seemed determined to make your life miserable? And what about General Stone? Can you understand how his own unresolved guilt and fear led him to treat his son so harshly? Leave me a comment below and let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story about family, redemption, and the power of truth, make sure to subscribe to the channel because I have many more incredible stories like this one coming your way. Speaking of which, you won't believe the story I have for you next. It's about a homeless man who was regularly mocked by the customers at a fancy restaurant until the day he revealed something that left everyone speechless. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for that one. Until next time, remember that the people in our lives, whether family, friends, or even difficult colleagues, often have stories we never imagine. Sometimes the person who challenges us the most is exactly the person we need to understand the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.